Welcome to the special guest host series of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, where I'm going to be handing over the mic to some incredible guest hosts. In each episode, you'll hear fresh perspectives and unique insights to inform and inspire you, and all the while, keeping the heart of this podcast alive. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Project. I'm Dr. Graham Taylor, and this is my colleague, Dr. Lawrie Ignacio. We're both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice for the past 25 plus years, specializing in individual and couples work and trauma therapy. Dr. Guy McPherson has kindly invited us to guest host on his awesome and very well-respected podcast platform. Did you know that his podcast is listed as number 8 on the 27 best mental health podcasts? That's pretty impressive, and we are so grateful to him for this opportunity, as well as the opportunity to have you as a listening audience joining us today.
Yes, exactly. You know, our focus for today's podcast is on a new integrative psychotherapeutic approach for treating trauma that Graham and I have created and that we're so excited to share with you.
Yeah.
Consider reflecting on those you work with in therapy as you listen to how we came to develop self-meaning-based therapy, or SMBT for short.
Yeah, listen for areas of similar challenge in your practice that we've experienced in ours. See if you too might resonate and identify with some of them. Our hope, as you listen to us, is that you'll appreciate that there's a way of working with traumatized patients that allows for permanent healing. Over the past 5 years, we've developed and implemented, as Lawrie said, an approach to therapy that we call self-meaning-based therapy. At the heart of SMBT is the uncovering of one's core negative self-meaning, which lies deeply within our unconscious. Lawrie, you and I have both worked effectively with a similar psychodynamic model for years, but we often each acknowledge to one another that inevitably there's a ceiling that we hit with patients, regardless of the therapeutic improvements that they experience with us.
Yes, that's exactly right, Graham. Primarily psychodynamic in our approach, right? We were really good at how we practiced. We did good work with patients. We helped them change various areas of their lives with success. As you also know in our work, like most therapists, we listen, clarify, reflect, educate, normalize, and help our patients manage the internal conflicts that plague them and their relationships. Given our primarily psychodynamic orientation to therapy, we help patients develop insight into the unconscious patterns of relating that were at the heart of their conflicts, and to actualize and sustain corrective emotional experiences in their lives. Again, right, we were successful in working with our patients, successful in helping them identify areas of vulnerability to get their needs met, helping them uncover relationship patterns in order to get these needs met, helping them problem solve and change patterns that kept them stuck. And we supported them in developing new self-directions and opportunities for change.
Yeah, and that's just it. While we were successful in our work, there consistently remained for us within our patients a core vulnerability, which, while it could be recognized with insight and named, it tended to remain unchanged regardless of the significant healing and growth experienced in their lives from their work in therapy with us. One of the ways that, Lawrie, you and I have described this core vulnerability is through the metaphor of a hole in a well-worn sidewalk. This hole represents one's core vulnerability, their trauma, a core untouchable wound. We also noticed that this hole tended to be affecting of every important relationship in our patients' lives. In terms of working with this hole, their core vulnerabilities around their trauma, which ultimately becomes a primary management focus of therapy, doesn't it, once recognized. We helped our patients understand its origin. We helped them identify, recognize, and manage it when it would show up in their lives. We taught them some best practice strategies for when they'd be triggered and their trauma got reactivated. And these strategies helped them not go down as deep if they did fall in, even again and again. These strategies also helped them to not stay down as long in their trauma when they did get activated, and also gave them some ways to get out of the trauma experience faster and faster each time. And what we'd see with time and practice was that our patients got better and better at being able to recognize times when they'd be trauma triggered and activated. when they'd fall back into that area of vulnerability. But they now be able to recognize it, and with the new treatment strategies, they learned how to not go down as deep when they did fall in. I wonder if some of you listening today, as you hear this treatment process, if it might sound similar to you in your work with some of your patients. But what Lawrie and I knew is that as smart and as empathic as we were as therapists, and regardless of how successfully our patients became at developing new awarenesses, new best practice strategies, and at creating multiple corrective emotional experiences in their lives, we knew that at the completion of therapy, our patients would still be left to live a life requiring some level of vigilance of their whole, that core trauma-based vulnerability that never fully went away. So while we had developed an understanding of its origin, ways it played out in their lives, and although they had developed effective strategies for managing it when it arose, they were still left, to a greater or lesser extent, vulnerable to being emotionally or cognitively hijacked, experientially activated and triggered, and re-traumatized when their core vulnerability, that core trauma wound, got activated. We'd see this pattern in folks experiencing a difficult time, let's say leaving an unhealthy, traumatizing relationship, and a tendency maybe to take undue responsibility and blame within a relationship of this nature. Or maybe we had a patient that experienced, let's say, a trauma of crossed sexual or physical boundaries that left them to see and define themselves as damaged or broken or not worthy of love. In fact, Lawrie, you've got an example of a patient's core vulnerability that made it very difficult to take action on her own behalf, even in a very different and dangerous situation that she was sharing with you in your work together.
Yes, yes, exactly. I worked with a patient for several years, as you know. She came from a first family that involved physical violence against both her and her mom at the hands of her father, of her dad.
Yeah.
My patient found it extremely hard to leave her own abusive relationship. She was a very successful attorney who remained in a long-standing, toxic, emotionally, and sometimes physically abusive relationship.
Yeah.
In therapy, she consistently expressed her awareness of how harmful the relationship was to her and her well-being. She would often say to me, "I know better than this, Lawrie. I am better than this. I watched my father do this to my mother, and he also did it to me."
Yeah.
There were many times during the course of our therapy together that her partner's aggression would escalate to the point of physical dangerousness. And every time she would garner the strength to carry out the plan we developed to safely leave him, until she got close to actually leaving. At that point, she became overwhelmed, hijacked, and anxious, dread-ridden.
Yeah.
And she would say basically, "How can I leave this guy? No one else is going to want to love me if I leave him. Deep down, I don't feel worthy. I'm not worthy of real love. I know this doesn't make sense," she'd say. "And in my head, I don't believe it. But deep down, it feels so true every time this happens." So she'd end up staying in the relationship again, in spite of this knowing, in spite of insight, in spite of my attempts to help her change her beliefs about herself or the relationship, in spite of engaging her in deep emotional processing about herself, her history, her first family relationships, and her current situation. Even invoking higher order problem-solving strategies didn't work. Perhaps those listening can relate to this. Her self-experience, "I'm not worthy of real love," was simply impenetrable. In our work with our patients, in cases like this and others, you and I, Graham, found ourselves hitting a therapeutic ceiling. In fact, some of our CBT, psychodynamic, humanistic, and even EMDR colleagues would share with us similar frustrations about the limits of their respective therapy frames in fostering real and permanent change.
Yeah. And then one day, a patient I was seeing changed everything for you and me, Lawrie, didn't it? I was working with a 47-year-old male. My patient's father had committed suicide when my patient was 6 years old. And one of our sessions, while processing this loss, my patient paused and he said, "Graham, what type of son must I have been if my father chose to take his life instead of staying around and raising me? He paused further and he said, you know what? I must not have been a good enough son. He paused again and said, I'm connecting all the times right now in my life that I've done things to try and overcome this sense that I'm not good enough, but I've never realized this self-meaning was what was driving me. This guy's background is he was a multimillionaire, multiple businesses, and he went out of his way to get others to like and to respect and to appreciate him. Now, here's an interesting note. We knew his father's childhood history to include his father having multiple abandonments in his life and attachment ruptures in his early years. And just prior to the suicide, my patient's mom had informed his father that she was going to leave him and that she was going to be taking their son with her. So, not being able to bear another abandonment and attachment rupture, the father preemptively took his life. And this was confirmed in a suicide note, basically explaining the anticipated pain of this upcoming loss and separation. So therapeutically, think about it. I had a very fortunate opportunity, didn't I? I had both insight into the father's developmental history and his relational psychology, and a suicide note confirming the true meaning behind the father's decision. So this allowed me to therapeutically teach my patient how he'd unconsciously assigned the self-meaning, I am not good enough, to explain to himself the cause for his father taking his life. With this information, I could now teach him how to shift his thinking to a more truth-based reframe of the realities behind his father's suicide and begin what I thought of as a healthy process to start mourning and grieving this loss in his life. But here's the thing, when I held these truths up to him, along with how others in his life now love and care for him, he responded with, you know what? I realize this, Graham, now, but despite this insight and these truths, I still hear that still small voice saying, yeah, but if you were really good enough, your father would have stayed around and raised you. And it was this self-meaning, I am not good enough, that he assigned about himself to make sense and cope with his father's suicide that actually birthed the beginnings of our SMBT. So we started to shift our therapeutic focus.
Yes, exactly. And so, again, it's the meaning one holds about one's very self that remains unamenable to change, as in the case of your patient. So this got us to revisit the research on the role of meaning making in our lives. We were reminded in so doing of the fact that we are all inherently relational meaning making beings, and that it's within our early family encounters that we learn about the world and ourselves in it. Most developmental theories, as we all know, share the basic assumption that the self develops early in interactions with others, and that self-construction is a meaning-making process. How children come to literally know and understand themselves is a complex, dynamic process, and the role of parents and caregivers, as well as larger family systems, are integral contexts in which self-concept is formed. We also know that flawless parenting and perfect contextual influences in which to grow up do not exist. Each of us has experienced, to a greater or minor extent, non-ideal circumstances from which to make sense of ourselves, others, and ourselves in relation to others and the world. Certainly, in many cases, these situations can be so detrimental that even existence itself becomes debilitating. The point here is that imperfect to harmful interactions in childhood leave us to make sense of why. By way of meaning-making processes based on normal magical thinking and adaptive egocentrism characteristic of early childhood, young children necessarily assume personal responsibility for this why. It must be because of who I am. Captures the essence of the intuitive reasoning invoked. And it's very characteristic of the early primitive omnipotence all young children share. Your patient, Graham, came to the understanding very young age, that his father killed himself because I'm not a good enough son. Essentially because I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
This self-meaning was what held your patient's deepest suffering, and it organized his entire life.
That's right.
In spite of objective evidence to the contrary.
Mm-hmm.
One's negative self-meaning is the hole in one's sidewalk. This is the core vulnerability that's impenetrable to most modes of therapy.
Yeah, let's refer back to the hole in the sidewalk. That hole, like you're saying, Lawrie, is our self-meaning. That's been self-created unknowingly and never gets fully removed. And it holds, as you're saying again, our deepest suffering. And here's the key that became very clear to us. Although we can name one's self-meaning, develop insight around it, one's self-meaning is stored in the unconscious. That's why it remains inaccessible through and unamenable to traditional talk therapy approaches, which operate primarily at a conscious day-to-day level of awareness. Think of Freud's topographical model for a moment, outlining the levels of consciousness. It's the model of the iceberg, isn't it? With the conscious mind being above the waterline and on the surface, and our unconscious being at the very bottom tip of the iceberg. Remember what van der Kolk says, consistent with empirical research on trauma and the mind, difficult to traumatic experiences tend to remain locked in nonverbal, non-rational, non-declarative areas of our brain, which contain core programming about the self. So what happens with our experiences and the core negative self-meaning we unconsciously develop around them? Well, that self-meaning gets unconsciously stored in our neural networks, along with its experiential aspects. And although we might be able to identify it, develop insight around it, and name our self-meaning at a conscious level, we're not able to access it and transform it there because it resides where? In our unconscious.
Yes, exactly. So this is why my patient knew she couldn't and wouldn't and didn't want to stay in an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
But she stayed anyway because she felt unworthy of love. I am unworthy of love. And this is why a suicide note and the knowledge that his father had severe attachment injuries couldn't shake your patient's self-meaning that I'm not good enough to keep my father alive.
Yeah.
We suggest that trauma is held in the form of self-meanings.
That's exactly right.
It's also important to emphasize that one's self-meaning is not rationally based. It's not reducible to a thought, a self-attribution, or even a core schema. As we've worked with our patients' self-meanings, we find that a self-meaning is best understood as an unconsciously held, unintegrated, phenomenological experience, one that can even defy verbal and rational description, let alone reasoning, insofar as it tends to be lived even at a place before words. Our self-meaning, as we've stated, has the power to shape our day-to-day interactions, our very lives, because it functions unconsciously. So it impacts us even without us knowing it. And that this is why it basically remains virtually untouchable.
That's right.
Its reach, therefore, remains timelessly pervasive. Our self-meaning powerfully influences our lives, particularly when it's emotionally, cognitively, experientially activated. So again, because it lives often in a place even before words, it remains unconsciously inaccessible, yet powerfully impactful, all the while remaining unamenable to healing via traditional talk therapy approaches. Yeah,
so what you and I realized, Lawrie, is that we needed a new approach to work successfully with trauma. And as we were talking and putting this together, we realized we needed an approach that could resolve the negative self-meaning based lie that we all carry, like I'm not good enough, or I'm unlovable, I don't matter, I'm worthless. And you and I both recognize as well that we needed an approach that would allow for the resetting of who we are based in truth. This new approach we also recognized would also need to be really a different method that would allow direct access to the unconscious, allowing us to transform the negative self-meaning where it resides. But we knew that to access the unconscious, this new approach would need to circumvent our defense mechanisms that are designed in the best possible way to keep our painful negative self-meaning out of awareness, as well as to help us tolerate intense affective and somatic experiences that come with the activation of our core negative self-meaning. And lastly, it was important to us as well that this new approach seamlessly and easily blended with a natural therapeutic process and complement, ideally, any theoretical model a practitioner utilizes in conducting their therapy.
That's exactly right. So we created self-meaning-based therapy.
Yeah.
Our SMBT approach is based in a nuanced, we believe, and comprehensive treatment model from which to ground all psychotherapeutic work. It's also an integrated model grounded in analytic, humanistic, and family systems theory, and it strategically incorporates the effectiveness of bilateral stimulation to elicit profound and lasting change. In a word, it is the experience of one's core negative self-meaning, the experience of it, that becomes the distinct focus of SMBT.
Yeah, and we continue to witness over and over that self-meaning-based therapy is able to dismantle and reset a patient's cornerstone negative self-meaning, thereby allowing them, among other things, to naturally adopt adaptive styles of life, access their inherent creativity, and positively actualize their fullest potential.
Yes, exactly. So rather than simply teaching patients how to manage the unconscious negative effects of their core self-meaning using best practice approaches, SMBT enables therapists to help patients permanently dismantle their self-meaning, an early adaptive lie born during childhood that was unknowingly never true from its inception. Absolutely. And which is no longer functional. In essence, self-meaning-based therapy enables therapist and patient to embark on an emancipatory project in which patients are able to harness a newly realized psychological freedom that allows them to reconnect with their intended design. It ultimately enables us to reconnect with our true self. Remember the metaphor we used previously of the hole in one sidewalk? SMBT renders the hole simply gone. There's no more hole in the sidewalk, no need to even take another street. It's been such an incredible journey to incorporate SMBT into our work and train our colleagues in our approach. We're grateful today for the opportunity to share SMBT with you.
Yeah, I so agree. It's been great to share this SMBT approach with you in this podcast, and we'd love the opportunity to further share our SMBT model with you. If you'd like to know more about self-meaning-based therapy, as well as the upcoming CE trainings we have for this year, you can check out our website at selfmeaningbasedtherapy.com. Self-meaningbasedtherapy, all one word, .com. And there you'll find videos and additional content explaining our model, along with the schedule of this year's trainings. Hey, thanks so much for being with us today. And Guy, thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you.